Like, it's a newer car, but I can still do what I want to it. And I think that's something the Russian car scene has. What is up, guys? Matthew, Actual Exotic Cars, and I apologize, I have not made a video in a little while, and as you can see, I have some new audio recording equipment here, so hopefully that makes the sound on this video a lot better than it has been in the past. So what is the topic for today's video? The topic for today's video, something that I've been kind of curious about and contemplating myself, is if they were going to make a Fast and Furious or like a Need for Speed or some sort of like automotive movie in Russia, like the automotive night scene, if you will, a racing scene, what vehicles would you use and what would the setting for that be? The entire inspiration I had of this came from Fast and Furious 8, which there was a scene that was supposed to be in some like undercover submarine base up in the Arctic in Russia somewhere, and it actually did display some Russian vehicles. Most notably, it had the Vaz 21213, also known as the Lada Niva, albeit most of them were being blown up. I was kind of disappointed, though. I thought they could have added maybe some more vehicles that would be more appropriate towards that scene. As far as I know, the military didn't really use or still doesn't really use Lada Nivas too much. I might be wrong on that. I thought maybe an UAZ Hunter, also known as a 469, would have been a little more appropriate for that scene, but that's just my personal thoughts. So basically going through most of the early Fast and Furious movies, and I will have some examples up on the screen here. So these are basically some iconic scenes from the early movie series, and obviously, first thing, I apologize for the cringy early 2000s. There's really nothing I can do about that. But basically, in my mind, the focus of this, obviously, yeah, there's a lot of partying and blah, 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 and other things going on as well. But in my mind, the cars are still the focus. And basically, a lot of these, not even Tokyo Drift, but the first few movies were mostly JDM cars. So that was a Skyline that was actually imported right-hand drive. We never got those in the U.S., by the way. They imported it for the movie, which I don't know necessarily why they did that. But again, you know, a lot of Evos. There was WRXs. I think there was some STIs, I want to say, in like the third or fourth movie, something like that. BRZs and some of the more recent ones. There's a lot of JDM vehicles in these movies, and I was kind of curious, I guess, what would that be? What would the equivalent RDM, Russian domestic vehicle, or SDM if you wanted, Soviet domestic vehicle, what vehicles would be the equivalent for that? And unfortunately, a lot of people don't really know too much about Russian vehicles. So that is the entire purpose of this. So if you were going to set like this type of movie, not in an LA, not in a Tokyo or Miami, as some of the past scenes have been for Fast and Furious movies, if you were to set one in, like, let's say Moscow, for example, what would you do and what vehicles would be included? So first thing, we kind of have to see what the scene is right now and if it's something that would make sense. So that's just a small clip of Moscow, actually about a year ago, and as somebody that's personally been there myself, I think this would be an ideal location for a car movie. I'm sure there's a lot of Russian ones that have already been made, but nothing really that has broken into the mainstream in the West. And like I said, Fast and Furious 8 kind of like taunted or hinted a little bit, and they did have Russian vehicles in the movie, as far as I know, for the first time. I just feel like they selected the wrong vehicle choice. So basically, these are the Ladas that were the main vehicles, or snowmobiles and some other military vehicles in the back that were displayed in the ending scenes of this movie. And again, they kind of spray painted them camo or something like that. And you can tell if you search for the Fast and Furious Lada Niva, This is kind of basically, go to images here. I'm just on Google right now. These are some of the images of what you see, which, by the way, I have no idea who did the writing for this movie, or at least the Russian writing. VVS Rasi, I'm sure, I apologize if I'm butchering that. Basically, that means like the Air Force of Russia. That's what this says. Which, first thing, I really don't think the military at all uses a lot of Neva or Avaz 21213. And on top of that, I really doubt that the Air Force especially uses that. And the Air Force really doesn't have anything to. This is like a submarine base. If anything, it would be the Navy. So you can tell right there, I don't really think they did enough research. I mean, kudos to them for actually putting a Russian, or I probably should say a Soviet vehicle in this movie. And I will say the entire premise of this vehicle is that it's on like a rebel-owned base, so it's not necessarily the Russian government. It didn't really make too much sense to me, but that's kind of the premise around it. No, yes, the Lada Niva is definitely a solid vehicle. If I was going to do some sort of like Moscow Drift movie, this is definitely more of a 4x4 off-roader. I think it would have been more appropriate for the movie itself if it had something more like an UAZ 469. They could have had a fleet of those, as well as maybe even the UAZ 452, the Buhankas. I think that would have been a great fit for the movie as well. Imagine some of these lifted up and going after the good guys in the movie. That would have been amazing. Unfortunately, we did not get to see that at all. And the UAZ is more, and it's still actively used by the Russian military. In my mind, that would have made more sense. I don't know who was really assigned to do the research for this movie, or if they just found the most, generic Russian vehicle they could and tossed it in there, just expecting that weirdos like me want to catch on to it. But that is kind of my thoughts. Now, I think the Gaz would have been a little too old for a scene for this movie. Again, the Gaz 69, which is also kind of an iconic precursor to the UAZ, that also may or may not have been a good idea. I probably wouldn't have included it just because I think it's a little too old. But that is also another viable option. Now, as far as a lot of streetcars go, there's actually a ton of tuning and stuff that can be done with the JDM market. For example, you have like a Nissan Skyline GTR R34, which was featured. I already showed a clip of that, and it was kind of like one of the highlights of the film. Toyota Supras are another great example of that. There's multiple Evos. The Mazda RX-7, that's also one of my favorite drifting scenes of that entire movie. Rotary engine, definitely very cool vehicles. And I'm not necessarily saying that the Russian vehicles have as much tunability as those vehicles that I just mentioned, but it definitely is a thing. So a lot of Moscow is kind of like a good tuning site for a lot of type vehicles. And before I really get too deep into this conversation and topic, I definitely think most of the vehicles, if you're going to make some sort of Russian-based or Moscow-based, like old-school Fast and Furious street scene, would be Ladas or Vazes. Maybe you would have a couple. I really doubt you'd have the Zazas, which are the Zaprovinets, which is a Ukrainian make. Those weren't necessarily known for power too much. Obviously, Vaz wasn't either. They did do a little bit more with the Vaz, especially when it came to, marketing and Western racing and whatnot, than they did with the other makes. UAZ, again, is more of an off-roader. Obviously, if you're doing a scene in like a frozen lake, or, there's some really cool pictures on Lake Baikal of a bunch of UAZs lined up, which I think is just amazing during the winter. And actually, my UAZ video that I made for my company, UAZ America, actually had some scenes of that, of some of these UAZs on the ice in Lake Baikal. I'll have a couple pictures of that here. There's definitely some really cool like off-road projects for vehicles that are on UAZ, and I definitely think they have their place in some sort of setting. I just don't think that or drifting or racing scene or anything like that is necessarily the bread and butter of the UAZ. It's kind of like featuring a Jeep Wrangler almost in like a Fast and Furious, like a street race. Like, that's not necessarily the purpose of these vehicles. It's not what they're necessarily used for. So that's kind of my thoughts on that. Again, here's just some cool pictures of various UAZs and I guess what their meat and potatoes and what they're known for. So for the purpose of this video, I'm mostly going to be focusing on Vaz vehicles, also known to the West as Lada. So what are some cool Ladas? The Lada Riva, in my mind, is kind of like the main Lada, I guess, that I think about, or the Kupieka. Those are kind of like the main. When I think Lada, those are the vehicles I think about. Again, you got to realize these, again, One of the first images that pops up here is this is a 2JZ swap Lada Riva, which actually would fit this scene perfectly. So like I said, there is definitely tunability for these vehicles, and when you go to the Eastern Bloc, these are very dirt cheap. I mean, you might be able to pick up one of these, you know, not in very good condition for a couple grand, which makes them fantastic for, in my mind, racing, drifting vehicles. Drifting Ladas is very popular in Russia right now. Unfortunately, obviously, we don't have the availability that we do, so you don't really see that in the States necessarily by the time you get them over here. But that is definitely a big thing. I mean, getting into more of the 90s, I think the Samara, in my mind, once you get 80s, 90s, it's definitely more of that type of vibe. Here's some pictures of the Lada Samara here. I definitely think you can do some things with that. Again, you can see the mud flaps in the back of this. You know, this is like as hot of a hatch as you're going to get out of a Russian car manufacturer. So I think this is pretty nifty myself. So I think these two vehicles alone have some merit. I mean, obviously you're not going to be able to make a full movie series off of just two vehicles. But again, I definitely think that vehicles like these would definitely fit the scene that we are trying to go for. Now, realistically speaking, if you ever go to Eastern Europe, American vehicles, especially in the night setting, the video that I showed at the beginning of this, basically show a lot of American cars. Granted, there was, some like Lambos and stuff, and you're going to find those all over the world. That's not really the type of vehicles that I'm talking about here. I'm talking about something the average person can own and tune up and so on and so forth. American cars are definitely very popular, but like I said, the entire idea of this is like a knockoff of Tokyo Drift, but like Moscow Drift. So yes, American cars are popular, but what are some Russian cars that we can focus on? Now, the big issue is that Ladas are pretty much based off of old Fiats. So that's a good and a bad thing. So Fiats are extremely popular in Europe. So with that being said, though, you could technically, any engine combination or tuning that you can do with a Fiat, you should be able to do something very similar with a Lada. And Ladas are actually a lot simpler. So the good thing about this is compared to like a Mitsubishi, the Toyotas, Mazdas, especially like a rotary or something like that, like you would be able to do almost anything you want with the Lada. So 2JZ swap would be extremely simple if you want to rip an engine out of a Skyline and shove it in there, or even the new engines that are in the Supras, the BMW based. I mean, it would be very simple to put JDM type engines just because they're a lot smaller and more efficient in one of these vehicles as well. And yeah, I'm sure if you wanted to go crazy and put like a 454 big block or do something stupid like that, granted that would be a much larger project. So in a lot of these vehicles too, there are rear wheel drive. They're small cars. They're rear wheel drive front engine. So the amount of possibilities you can do with a vehicle like this is actually kind of crazy. So if you could pick up one of these bodies pretty cheap, I mean, the tunability is amazing. I've even been thinking personally myself putting like a TDI out of a Volkswagen or something in one of these. Because they're very bare bones, they're very simple, they don't have too many electronics. My 98 Niva, for example, that is going to be imported into the US pretty soon. Again, 1998, no power steering, manual windows, carbureted with a manual choke. And yeah, that might sound like really way behind in the times, but it has like no electronics at all. And in my mind, that's a positive. I can do whatever I want with that vehicle. I don't really have to worry about ECUs and reprogramming things. Or let's say I had an automatic and I wanted to throw a manual in there. I wouldn't have to worry about, oh, I got to put this chip in or do this or reprogram this or get this flashed. Or if I wanted to do the same thing, vice versa. Like, it's a newer car, but I can still do what I want to it. And I think that's something the Russian car scene has that most other car scenes do not have. So that's kind of my thought on it. As far as the newer Lada vehicles, most of them are actually based off of French vehicles. So Lada basically, with the exception of, I would say, probably the Niva, most vehicles have kind of been communist ripoffs, I guess, of other more well-known vehicles. So the early Ladas were based off of the Fiat, notably the Fiat 124, while later on they're more, I want to say, like Renault's French type vehicles. So as far as tunability and things for that go, it's not necessarily going to be the same. I will say, though, you can still get a brand new Lada for around 10 grand. So there's definitely a lot of things you can do with that. Now, getting back here to some of the tuning websites, so Lada Moscow, if you look here, there's different things that you can do. Neva tuning, that would be another one. Would I include a Neva necessarily in a Fast and Furious movie? I mean, it could have a place, obviously. Yeah, I would prefer something all-wheel drive and not necessarily four-wheel drive. I just think that would make more sense. But that is just personal, my personal thoughts on the matter. Here, 5-speed gearbox, you can also get different differentials. It'd be pretty easy to swap out back and forth. And also something that's very notable is the Russian auto industry, or I should say more accurately, the Soviet auto industry, was actually ironically based off of the American auto industry. So some vehicles, for example, the GAZ-13, the Chaikas, which are way beyond anything that would be in my price range, you can see here that they pretty much, I'll have some images of them on the screen here, they pretty much look like an American type muscle car. So if you're expecting a vehicle for like Dom, like some sort of Charger or something like that, I definitely think that getting a Chaika with like a big blower or something sticking out of the hood would be amazing. So there are vehicles like that. Some of the old Gaz cars are definitely very noticeable. I think some of them are even like an all-wheel or a four-wheel drive. Here's a Volga, Gaz 24. A lot of the Soviet elites drove these. So the Vaz was more of like the everyday person's car. The Volga was definitely like an exclusive, communist elite vehicle here. And I definitely think there's a place for these. I mean, you can lift these up. And these vehicles are made for Russia. So everything's much more bulkier. The frame's built up more, the panels might be thicker, the glass is thicker. So that's kind of what these vehicles are known for, and they're made for more harsh roads. So I definitely think you'd be able to make a really cool film about this. So basically, before I rattle off for too long, I do want to say I have been looking more into Ladas and trying to import those abroad. My first shipment, official shipment, I should say, for UAZ America should be shipping out sometime this next week. And I think it would be very cool if we tried incorporating Lada or something along those lines. Like I said, there's definitely a car scene there. There's definitely a tuning scene there. Now, whether it's up to the same level as, I would say, the JDM scene is, not known at the current moment. But I definitely think it has a lot of advantages over JDM. And you got to realize the reason JDM vehicles took off like they did is compared to American vehicles, they're cheaper, they're more fuel efficient, they're easier to work on, they're more reliable. And I think a lot of those things are something that a lot of old Russian vehicles, ironically, not all of those things, but definitely can compete with. They're definitely more cheaper, they're way easier to work on, they're way easier to tune. And a lot of these JDM vehicles were made for tuning. I mean, if you bought a Skyline R34 GTR, it was made to tune. That's literally what the vehicle was made for. Same thing with some of the old Supras. You can definitely go down the list of vehicles. They were made to be easy to work on. I think that a lot of vehicles like the Vazas, even some of the old Gazas, take that to the extreme. They're very easy to work on, especially in the States. For example, in UAZ, you might only be getting like 70 horsepower. If you want to drop in like a Ford Ranger engine, I know that's something that's very popular. I've seen a lot of videos of people dropping in like Toyota engines and whatnot in UAZs. It's a very simple engine swap to do. These are very simple bare bones vehicles. So if you wanted to make a lot of horsepower, do something cool, and honestly just have like a really cool looking vehicle. So cheap, cool looking, it's very easy to work on, very easy to change things out. Personally, I might be doing a series upcoming, I haven't decided yet, where I might put a Volkswagen TDI in my UAZ just because I think it would be an easy swap to do and it'd be something fun. And especially videoing the process, I think would be pretty enjoyable. That's what these vehicles in my mind are the bread and butter. Now, stock, do they compete against current vehicles? No, not at all. Not even close. You got to realize for the most part, this is like 70s, 80s, Italian technology and manufacturing. Does that compete against brand new vehicles? If you're going to have like a Lada 2104 going head-to-head against a brand new Corvette, yeah, it's not going to work out very well. Now, if you put a twin-turbo 2GZ out of like a 90 Supra into one of these, then yeah, you might have a chance. So that is something that I think is very easy to do. Hopefully, at some point, this takes off in the U.S. If any film producers or anybody's listening, I definitely think that is something that would be cool, unique, and I definitely know there is a scene for this in Eastern Europe right now, but unfortunately, it hasn't made its way across the pond yet. So hopefully, at some point, a lot of America can become a thing. I would love to be involved with this process. I do have connections for a lot of vehicles. Right now, I'm just trying to focus on getting this UAZ thing down before I extend what I can do. So again, thank you for watching. I appreciate it. And before I let you go, little shameless merch plug. I have some very cool designs for UAZ America coming out, which I'm excited to bring out. I will have a link for that stuff down in the description if you want to check out some UAZ America merchandise. Maybe you don't want to buy an UAZ, but you definitely like the project or want to support me or support the project. Again, I don't make that much money off this. It's more for advertising and getting the word out about UAZ. Feel free to purchase if you want to, and thank you, and I will see you next time.
1988 Lada. This thing is 2JZ swapped, weighs 2,000 pounds, and has a manual transmission. This thing is gonna be a freaking blast. Let's go check it out.